There are moments in American cultural history that stop people cold, not because of what happened, but because of what did not happen. On July 3, 2012, one of the most beloved figures in the history of American television passed away at his home on Roanoke Island, North Carolina. Andy Griffith, the man who had spent decades warming the hearts of millions through his unforgettable performances, was gone. But before most of America even learned the news, before a single camera crew could drive to the island, before any network anchor could prepare a tribute segment, Andy Griffith had already been buried. The whole thing was over in less than 5 hours. When the news finally broke, the reaction was a strange mixture of grief and confusion. People across the country turned on their televisions expecting to see the kind of elaborate public farewell that usually accompanies the death of a major celebrity. They expected the flowers, the tearful interviews, the gathering of famous friends outside a grand memorial venue. Instead, they found that there was nothing to show. The man had already been laid to rest, quietly and privately, exactly as he had always wanted. For millions of fans, that discovery was almost as shocking as the loss itself. Many people did not understand it. Some felt hurt by it. And some, after thinking about it carefully, understood it better than anything else Andy Griffith ever did. To understand why Andy Griffith made that choice, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to Mayberry, not to the television studio, but to a small town in North Carolina where a boy grew up with very little and dreamed of something much larger than the world around him. Andy Samuel Griffith was born on June 1, 1926, in Mount Airy, North Carolina. The town was small, quiet, and deeply rooted in Southern tradition. His father, Carl Griffith, worked as a carpenter, and the family lived modestly. There was no running water in the early years of his childhood. There was no luxury, no privilege, and no obvious path toward fame or success. What there was, however, was a voice. Even as a young boy, Andy Griffith possessed something in his voice that set him apart from other children around him. His church choir director recognized it almost immediately. That recognition became the first turning point of his life. Music gave Andy Griffith his earliest sense of identity and purpose. Singing in the church choir connected him to something larger than the ordinary circumstances of his daily life. It gave him confidence in a platform, however small, to be seen and heard. That desire to be heard would eventually carry him far beyond the borders of Mount Airy. He attended the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he studied music and developed his instincts as a performer. He was not a wealthy student from a privileged background. He was a young man from a working-class family who had earned his place through natural ability and genuine determination. After graduating, Griffith began performing a comedy monologue called What It Was Football, a recording that became surprisingly popular across the South. The piece was clever, warm, and distinctly Southern in its humor. It introduced him to a wider audience and opened doors that his modest background might otherwise have kept firmly closed. From that point forward, Andy Griffith began building a career one careful step at a time, understanding that everything he had achieved came from hard work rather than inherited advantage. The role that first revealed the true depth of his talent arrived in 1955, when Griffith appeared in the Broadway production of No Time for Sergeants. He played Will Stockdale, a Georgia farm boy drafted into the military, a character whose innocent simplicity created chaos everywhere he went. The role fit him naturally, perhaps too naturally. Audiences saw a performer who seemed completely at ease in his own skin, someone whose humor came from a genuine and unforced place. Critics praised him warmly, and Broadway audiences embraced him with immediate enthusiasm. The production became a hit, and Andy Griffith became a recognizable name in entertainment circles almost overnight. Hollywood noticed. The film adaptation followed in 1957, and Griffith repeated his success in front of the camera. But what came next was the performance that would genuinely surprise everyone, including the people who thought they had already figured out exactly what Andy Griffith was capable of delivering. In 1957, director Elia Kazan cast him in A Face in the Crowd, a film that stood in complete contrast to everything audiences had seen from him before. Instead of the lovable innocent, Griffith played Lonesome Rhodes, a charismatic drifter whose folksy charm masked a deeply cynical and manipulative nature. Rhodes used his connection with ordinary people as a weapon, exploiting their trust while privately holding them in contempt. The performance was startling. It was dark, layered, and psychologically complex in a way that nobody had expected from the warm and approachable man they had seen in No Time for Sergeants. Critics were genuinely stunned. Many called it one of the finest dramatic performances of that era. The film proved that Andy Griffith possessed far more range than anyone had assumed. He could go to uncomfortable places as a performer. He could portray ugliness and moral corruption with frightening conviction. For a brief moment, it seemed like Griffith might build a career in serious dramatic film work, following the path of actors who were celebrated for complexity and emotional depth. But Hollywood is always listening to its audiences more carefully than it listens to its critics, and audiences had already made their feelings clear. They did not want a dark and complicated Andy Griffith. They wanted the warm one. They wanted the innocence, the humor, and the gentle Southern charm. The industry heard that message and responded accordingly. When television producer Sheldon Leonard approached Griffith in 1960 with the concept for a small-town sheriff series set in a fictional North Carolina community called Mayberry, Griffith accepted. That decision would define the next several decades of his public life in ways he could not have fully anticipated at the time. The Andy Griffith Show premiered on October 3, 1960, and almost immediately became something far more significant than a popular television program. The show arrived during a period of genuine national anxiety. The Cold War had settled into the fabric of everyday American life, bringing with it a low and persistent hum of fear that never completely went away. The civil rights movement was challenging fundamental assumptions about equality and justice across the country. Political tensions ran deep, and a sense of rapid and unsettling change touched nearly every corner of American society. Into that atmosphere, Mayberry arrived like a deep breath. The fictional town offered something that much of America desperately needed but could rarely find in its actual daily experience. Life in Mayberry moved slowly and purposefully. Problems were resolved through conversation, patience, and mutual understanding rather than force or confrontation. Neighbors trusted each other. Communities looked after their own. And at the center of it all stood Sheriff Andy Taylor, a man who carried no gun, raised his son alone with extraordinary tenderness, and solved every conflict through wisdom and quiet humanity. Andy Griffith understood exactly what the show was doing for its audience, and he took that responsibility seriously. He was not simply performing a role. He was providing comfort to millions of people who were navigating genuinely difficult circumstances. The character he played became a symbol of something larger than entertainment. Sheriff Andy Taylor represented a version of American goodness and decency that people feared was disappearing from the real world. By giving audiences that symbol, Griffith performed a kind of public service that went far beyond anything he had originally set out to do as an entertainer. The show ran for 8 seasons and finished its final year ranked number 1 in the Nielsen ratings, an achievement that almost never happens with long-running series. It launched careers, created cultural touchstones, and embedded itself so deeply into the American imagination that decades after the last episode aired, people were still turning to it for comfort during hard times. The whistled theme song alone was enough to bring a particular kind of warmth to anyone who had grown up with the show. Mayberry had become part of the country's emotional vocabulary. But success on that scale comes with a price that is rarely discussed openly, and Andy Griffith paid it in ways that his audiences never fully understood. The longer the show ran, the harder it became for Andy Griffith to exist separately from the character he played. Fans did not draw a clear line between the performer and the performance. They encountered Sheriff Andy Taylor everywhere they looked, and when they met the real man in person, they expected to find the same patient wisdom, the same gentle humor, the same quiet reassurance. Strangers approached him in restaurants and grocery stores, calling him sheriff with the kind of affection that was entirely genuine but also fundamentally disorienting for a man who knew exactly how different he was from the figure they admired. People who worked closely with Griffith throughout his career consistently described a man of deep contradictions. He could be genuinely generous, encouraging, and warm. He was capable of great kindness toward people he trusted. But he could also be distant, demanding, and emotionally unpredictable in ways that surprised those around him. The man who appeared effortlessly calm and reassuring on camera spent considerable energy away from it managing pressures that the public never saw. The weight of being everyone's idea of decency and wisdom was not a light thing to carry year after year. His personal life reflected that weight honestly. His first marriage to Barbara Bray Edwards, his college sweetheart, ended in 1972 after 20 years together. Those who knew the couple believe that the relentless demands of fame had slowly eroded the private foundation of their relationship. The constant scrutiny, the long separations, and the difficulty of maintaining ordinary intimacy while living as a public symbol all took their toll over time. His son Andy Jr., known as Sam, carried emotional scars from that period well into adulthood. His adopted daughter Dixie rarely spoke publicly about those years, and when she did, her words were measured and careful in a way that communicated how deeply the experience had affected her. A second marriage, to actress Salika Kasuto in 1973, lasted only 6 years before ending as well. By the time that relationship concluded, Griffith had come to a clear-eyed and somewhat painful understanding of the relationship between public fame and private happiness. The two did not coexist easily. The more the world loved the image, the harder it became to protect the reality underneath. In 1968, Griffith made a decision that confused much of the entertainment industry. He walked away from the Andy Griffith Show while it was still performing at the top of the ratings. Most performers in that position would have held on as long as the audience remained willing. But Griffith was exhausted in ways that ratings numbers could not measure. The creative confinement of playing the same beloved character year after year had begun to feel less like a privilege and more like a kind of artistic imprisonment. He also harbored a persistent desire to prove that his abilities extended beyond the comfortable boundaries of Mayberry. The years that followed were professionally difficult. His attempts to establish himself in film and in different television formats met with limited success. The public, it turned out, was not particularly interested in seeing Andy Griffith do something unexpected or challenging. They wanted the version of him they already knew and loved. The critical success of A Face in the Crowd a decade earlier had demonstrated his range clearly, but audiences had long since made their peace with a simpler understanding of who he was and what he represented. By the middle of the 1970s, Griffith found himself in a professionally uncomfortable position, respected but no longer central, admired but no longer sought after in the way he had once been. It was a disorienting experience for a man who had spent years at the very top of American popular culture. He moved through projects without finding the sustained success that might have given him the creative satisfaction he was searching for. Then, in 1983, his physical health collapsed in a way that changed everything. Andy Griffith was diagnosed with Guillain-Barré syndrome, a serious neurological condition in which the body's immune system turns against its own nervous system. The illness progressed with frightening speed. Griffith, a man whose entire professional life had been built on the precise control of his voice, his movement, and his presence, lost the ability to walk. For a period that felt impossibly long to someone with his temperament and history, he was entirely dependent on others for the most basic physical functions. The experience of that illness reshaped something fundamental in Andy Griffith. People who knew him well observed a change in his perspective that went beyond the physical effects of the disease. He had confronted his own mortality in the most direct possible way. He had experienced genuine helplessness. And he had been forced to think very carefully about what mattered to him, what he wanted the remaining chapters of his life to look like, and what kind of ending he hoped for when the time eventually came. His professional recovery arrived with Matlock in 1986. The legal drama gave Griffith something genuinely valuable, a character who carried his natural warmth and southern charm but also possessed a calculating intelligence and a willingness to use strategic ambiguity in pursuit of justice. Benjamin Matlock was not Sheriff Andy Taylor. He was sharper, more complex, and more morally interesting. The show ran for 9 seasons and restored Griffith's standing as a major figure in American television. More importantly for Griffith personally, it gave him a creative experience that felt more honest than much of what had come before. But even as his career found its footing again, the private man continued developing conclusions about fame, public life, and the particular vulnerability that comes with being a beloved cultural figure. He had watched colleagues and contemporaries lose themselves completely inside the images the public had constructed around them. He had observed how the entertainment industry handled the deaths of famous people, transforming private grief into television programming, surrounding hospitals with cameras, and turning funerals into spectacles that bore little resemblance to anything genuinely personal or intimate. He found all of it deeply troubling. Not in an angry way, but in the quiet way of a man who had spent enough time thinking carefully about the difference between a public life and a real one. He had been giving pieces of himself to audiences since the late 1950s. He had provided comfort, laughter, wisdom, and warmth to generations of viewers who had welcomed him into their homes through their television screens. That relationship was real, and he never dismissed or minimized it. But it was also, at its core, a performance. And when the performance ended, Andy Griffith believed that what remained was simply a man, with the same rights to privacy and dignity that any other man deserved. In the years following his third marriage to Cindy Knight in 1983, Griffith found the personal stability that had eluded him for most of his adult life. Cindy became the partner he had always needed, someone who understood both the public figure and the private man, and who committed herself to protecting what mattered most to him. Their life together on Roanoke Island was deliberately quiet. The island's natural beauty, its salt air, its unhurried rhythms, all of it appealed to a man who had spent decades in the relentless machinery of entertainment. Griffith spoke to Cindy openly and specifically about his final wishes. He was not vague or indirect about what he wanted. He had thought through the details with the same kind of careful intentionality that he had brought to many of the most important decisions of his life. He did not want a public funeral. He did not want media coverage. He did not want strangers gathering at a venue to mourn a character from a television show. He wanted to be buried quietly, on the property he loved, before the news of his passing could be transformed into a public event by an industry that had always been more interested in the image than in the man. North Carolina law permitted private burial on personal property under specific legal conditions, and the Griffith family had researched those conditions thoroughly long before they became relevant. The necessary permits could be obtained quickly when circumstances required it, and local officials were both aware of the family's wishes and respectful of the legitimate legal framework that supported them. Nothing about what happened was improvised or chaotic. It was planned, documented, and prepared with the kind of quiet thoroughness that reflected Andy Griffith's character at its most honest. On the morning of July 3, 2012, Andy Griffith died at his home on Roanoke Island at the age of 86. He had been in declining health for some time. His heart had weakened progressively in the years following his battle with Guillain-Barré syndrome, and those closest to him had understood for a while that the end was approaching. He died peacefully, at home, with Cindy beside him. There were no dramatic last words prepared for public consumption. There was no performance at the end. There was simply a man, in his own home, on an island he loved, with the person he trusted most. Within 5 hours, he was buried on the grounds of his property, exactly as he had asked. No announcement had been made to the press. No television network had been notified. No public statement had been released. By the time journalists and camera crews made their way to Roanoke Island, there was nothing left to document. The burial had already happened. The privacy Andy Griffith had spent the last decades of his life carefully constructing had held, even at the very end. The public reaction, when the news finally broke, was predictably complicated. Many fans expressed genuine hurt. They felt that a man they had loved for so long, a man